Ryan Mitchell had always considered himself a career-driven man. At 30, he was already making a name for himself as a marketing executive at one of New York's fast-growing tech startups. His job demanded long hours, constant travel, and a sharp focus that often left little room for anything else. But he didn't mind. To Ryan, success wasn't just a goal, it was a necessity. And while it meant sacrificing his personal life at times, he believed that his hard work would eventually pay off. At home, Ryan had a quiet, comfortable apartment in Manhattan, just a few blocks from the bustling city streets that never seemed to sleep. It wasn't a huge space, but it was his sanctuary, a place where he could relax after a grueling day at the office. For the past 3 years, he shared this sanctuary with his girlfriend, Emily Carter, a 28-year-old freelance graphic designer with a creative soul and a laid-back personality. Emily had a different rhythm to her life. She was her own boss, working from home with a schedule that allowed her to travel, take on spontaneous projects, and live life at her own pace. Their relationship had always been a delicate balance of opposites. Ryan's intensity and ambition often clashed with Emily's free-spirited nature, but somehow they made it work. They complemented each other in a way that felt natural, even if it wasn't always perfect. Ryan admired Emily's creativity and her ability to find beauty in things that others might overlook. Emily, on the other hand, respected Ryan's drive and his unwavering commitment to his career. But as the months passed, there was an undercurrent of tension. Neither of them fully acknowledged Ryan was consumed by his work, and Emily, while supportive, started to feel the growing distance between them. Yet, it wasn't something they openly discussed. They were both busy, both focused on their own lives, and somehow they convinced themselves that everything was fine. As Ryan prepared for a 6-month business trip to London, an opportunity he couldn't pass up, he and Emily had one final conversation about their plans for the time apart. They agreed to stay in touch text, often in video call when they could. It wasn't ideal, but Ryan reassured Emily that once the trip was over, they would have plenty of time to reconnect. Emily seemed on board, but there was something in her eyes that Ryan didn't quite understand. A fleeting look of uncertainty, perhaps, or maybe it was just the weight of the unknown. Still, Ryan pushed those thoughts aside. He had a job to do, and his mind was fully set on the tasks ahead. He hugged Emily tightly before leaving for the airport, promising her that he would be back before she knew it. The airport terminal was filled with the typical rush of travelers, but as he passed through the security gates and boarded the plane, Ryan felt a sense of excitement building in his chest. This trip could change everything for his career, and it was just the beginning. Little did he know this trip would change more than his career. It would change the course of his relationship with Emily forever. The first few weeks in London were everything Ryan had hoped for. The city's fast-paced atmosphere, its endless energy, and the cutting-edge tech scene made him feel like he was in the right place, doing exactly what he was meant to do. From the moment he arrived, he was thrown into meetings with executives, brainstorming sessions with creatives, and conference calls that stretched well into the late hours of the night. The thrill of being at the heart of it all fueled his ambition even more. For Ryan, there was no such thing as enough work. He thrived on challenges, and every project, every presentation was a chance to prove himself even further. As the days passed, his routine became a blur of spreadsheets, emails, and networking events. London's bustling streets felt like a new kind of home, even if it wasn't quite the same as his apartment back in New York. His tiny flat in the city's East End had a charm of its own, with its mismatched furniture and the constant hum of traffic outside the windows. He wasn't used to living alone, and there were nights when the silence felt heavier than usual. He missed the comfort of his own bed, the warmth of Emily's voice when they'd fall asleep after a late-night conversation. Yet despite this, he convinced himself that this was just part of the journey. He had to focus on his goals, on the work that was so important to him. For the first few months, he and Emily stayed in touch. Texts were exchanged throughout the day. Quick good morning, messages, a photo here and there, small updates on what they were each doing. Emily would send him pictures of her art projects, or the occasional sunset she was admiring from a cafe in the city. Ryan, in turn, would send her snapshots of his London office photos of the famous landmarks he was visiting between meetings, or the view from his hotel room. But as time went on, the frequency of their conversations began to slow down. Ryan's workload increased, and Emily's messages started to feel less frequent as well. At first, Ryan didn't think much of it. He was busy, and so was she. Her freelance work was unpredictable, and there were days when he would call, only to hear that she was in the middle of something important, or running errands. It was normal, he thought, but slowly the texts became shorter. Where once there had been long, deep conversations about everything from their future together to their favorite memories, now there were just quick check-ins. "I miss you" texts and "hope you're doing well." Messages, Ryan told himself. It was nothing to worry about, that the time apart was just creating a gap in their communication. He didn't want to admit that something was off, not just with their relationship, but with the way Emily was starting to seem more distant. Even on video calls, her eyes didn't have the same sparkle. She would smile, but it didn't reach her eyes the way it once had. When Ryan asked how she was doing, she would give him a vague response saying she was good or fine, but he could tell there was something more beneath the surface. Still, he pushed those feelings aside, too caught up in the whirlwind of work and the excitement of his career advancement. In London, Ryan found himself developing new friendships and connections. His colleagues were a mix of young, ambitious professionals who were just as eager to climb the corporate ladder as he was. The nights he wasn't working, he found himself joining them at pubs or attending high-end events hosted by the company. There was always something happening, some new person to meet, some new opportunity to seize. Yet, despite all the excitement, there was a nagging sense of isolation that crept in during the quiet moments of the evening when everyone else was heading home and Ryan was left alone in his flat. He tried not to dwell on it. He convinced himself that this was just a phase he was in London for his career after all, and soon he would be back home with Emily. But when the months wore on, the absence of the woman he loved started to feel more like a void than just a temporary separation. He began to question whether it was the distance that was straining their relationship, or whether it was something deeper, something that had started long before he left. But whenever he tried to talk to Emily about it, she would brush it off, assuring him that everything was fine. And so, Ryan buried himself even deeper into his work, trying to avoid confronting the uneasy feeling that had taken root in his chest. He told himself that once the trip was over, they would have time to talk and fix whatever might be wrong. The days flew by faster than he expected, and before he knew it, he was wrapping up his final week in London. He was excited to return home to see Emily, to reconnect and talk through everything that had been left unsaid. But as the days counted down, he felt an unfamiliar tension building. Something told him that the homecoming he had imagined a reunion filled with joy, excitement, and the relief of finally being together again might not go the way he expected. He tried to push the feeling aside, but deep down, he couldn't shake the sense that something had changed between them, something that couldn't be easily fixed by a simple phone call or a return to old routines. The flight back to New York felt like an eternity. Ryan couldn't help but replay the last few months in his mind. London had been everything he'd hoped for professionally, but personally, it had been a test of his patience, his commitment, and his ability to maintain a relationship across an ocean. He had been eager to get home to see Emily and to finally bridge the gap that had been growing between them. But as his plane descended over the city skyline, a sense of unease settled in his chest. He had imagined this moment countless times, finally walking through the door of their apartment, seeing Emily waiting for him, with open arms, hearing her say she missed him, asking him about every little detail of his trip. He had envisioned laughter, warmth, and that feeling of homecoming he had longed for. But as the taxi pulled up in front of their building, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that everything might be different. When he reached their apartment, the first thing that struck him was the silence. The building felt strangely quiet, almost deserted. Ryan had lived there for years, and he was used to the occasional noise of neighbors or the hum of traffic outside. But now everything seemed muted. He unlocked the door with the key he'd kept with him all this time, expecting to hear the familiar creak of the floorboards or the smell of dinner cooking in the kitchen. Instead, the apartment greeted him with an eerie emptiness. He called out for Emily. No response. The silence stretched on too long for comfort. He stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. Something wasn't right. The apartment didn't look like the space he remembered. It wasn't the same warm, cozy environment he'd left behind. The furniture was slightly rearranged and the air had a stale quality to it, as if it hadn't been lived in for months. His first instinct was to grab his phone and call Emily. But before he could even reach for it, he heard voices coming from the back of the apartment. He froze. At first he thought it was just his imagination. Maybe the sound of the neighbors coming through the thin walls. But as the voices grew louder, he realized they were coming from his own home. Ryan's heart began to race. He walked cautiously down the hallway toward the source of the voices, his mind spinning. His thoughts scrambled, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe Emily had invited some friends over to welcome him home, or maybe there was some sort of surprise waiting for him. But as he rounded the corner into the living room, his stomach dropped. There in his apartment were two strangers sitting on the couch chatting like they owned the place. Ryan stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what he was seeing. One of the strangers, a man, was lounging with his feet up on the coffee table, laughing at something on his phone. The woman sitting next to him had a relaxed demeanor, scrolling through a magazine. His apartment was now theirs. Excuse me. Ryan's voice cracked slightly, his confusion morphing into a mixture of anger and disbelief. The two strangers looked up in shock, their eyes wide with surprise. The man stood up slowly as if unsure of what to do next. I'm sorry, we didn't know anyone was coming by today. He said, his tone casual but clearly uncomfortable. Ryan's jaw clenched as he tried to make sense of the situation. What are you doing in my apartment? He demanded, his voice louder. Now the shock wearing off, replaced with a sense of panic and outrage. The woman stood up now too, her expression apologetic but confused. This is your apartment? She asked, glancing around the room in surprise. We were told this was available for rent. Ryan blinked, trying to absorb her words. Rent. What do you mean, available for rent? His mind was racing, the words not quite fitting together. The man cleared his throat awkwardly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Well, we found the listing online. Your girlfriend Emily, she rented it out to us while you were away. Ryan's blood ran cold. His first thought was that there must be some mistake. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Emily had decided to sublet the apartment while he was gone to save on rent or make some extra money. But why hadn't she told him about it? Why hadn't she called him? At least. He felt a wave of frustration and confusion wash over him. Emily rented out my apartment. Ryan repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, disbelief settling in. Yeah, she said it would only be temporary. The man replied, looking unsure of how much he should say. She seemed like she was in a hurry, but we signed the lease and everything. Ryan's mind raced. How could Emily have done this without telling him? How could she have gone behind his back, making decisions without consulting him? He had trusted her with everything, his career, his life, his home, and now here he was, standing in the middle of his own living room, confronting two strangers who had no idea what was going on. Where is she? Ryan demanded. Where is Emily? The woman glanced at her phone, then back at Ryan. She's not here right now. She told us she was out running errands. She said she'd be back later. Ryan's frustration reached its peak. He turned on his heel and stormed toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to find Emily, had to get answers, and the idea of waiting around for her to come home wasn't something he was willing to do. He grabbed his phone and texted Emily, demanding an explanation. But deep down, a gut-wrenching feeling told him that the answers he was about to get might change everything. Ryan's breath was shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears as he stood on the threshold of his own apartment, still reeling from the encounter with the strangers on his couch. The world around him seemed to blur and spin, as if everything he had known in his life was suddenly unraveling before his eyes. He had imagined so many scenarios of what his return to New York would be like, but none of them even remotely resembled this. The seconds ticked by, each one dragging out the tension that had settled in his chest. The strangers in his apartment, their casual confusion, the calmness with which they spoke of a lease agreement. Everything about it felt surreal. For a moment, Ryan thought he might be dreaming, or perhaps caught in some kind of twisted joke. But the weight of his phone in his hand, the cold air of the apartment, and the muffled sounds from the hallway all felt too real to be anything but the worst kind of reality. He stepped outside, needing fresh air to clear his head, but the cool evening breeze did nothing to ease the pressure building behind his eyes. The lights of the city twinkled around him, yet everything felt distant, as though the world had continued moving without him, while he was thousands of miles away. His mind raced. How could Emily do this to me? The question echoed over and over, but no answer came. He had trusted her. He had been loyal to her for the years they'd been together, building a life he thought they would share. But now she had rented out his apartment. Their apartment without his knowledge, without any warning. There was no excuse, no reason he could think of that could justify this. He tried to call her. His fingers trembled as he dialed her number, the screen lighting up in the dim light. His heart dropped as the call went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again. Nothing. The voicemail message was the same every time. "Hey, it's Emily. Leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can." Ryan's frustration grew. He didn't want to be left with these questions with this gnawing sense of betrayal. He needed answers, and he needed them now. His thoughts became a whirlwind of accusations and doubts. Had she been planning this all along? Was there something more going on here that he didn't know? The more he thought about it, the more he realized just how little he actually knew about Emily's life while he'd been away. For the next few hours, Ryan paced the streets, his mind a whirlwind. He tried calling her friends, but none of them picked up. He left a string of increasingly desperate messages, each one more frantic than the last, demanding that she explain herself. His fingers were raw from typing and calling, but the unanswered calls and texts only made him feel more isolated. By the time he returned to his apartment, the strangers were gone. Ryan stood in the doorway staring at the now empty living room. The silence felt deafening, even worse than when he had first entered. He walked over to the couch, running his hand over the worn fabric. His thoughts were a blur of confusion, anger, and hurt. He had so many questions, but no answers, no explanation from Emily, no rationalization that made any sense. As the evening wore on, the anger that had been boiling inside him began to settle into something darker doubt. He couldn't stop himself from questioning everything. Was there something he had missed all these months? Had Emily's behavior changed in ways he didn't notice? He thought about the long-distance calls and late-night texts that had seemed so normal, the small gaps in their conversations where Emily seemed distracted or distant. Was she seeing someone else? The idea gnawed at him. He had never considered it before, but now it felt impossible to ignore. Why hadn't she told him about renting out the apartment? Why hadn't she contacted him while he was away, if not to explain what she had done? If she had really intended to return the place to him when he got back, why not simply let him know? Ryan couldn't help but replay their last conversations in his head, wondering if there had been hidden meanings or signs he had missed. He thought back to their last day together, before his business trip. Emily had seemed so confident, so sure of everything. But then again, so had he. Maybe they had both been pretending everything was fine, keeping up appearances while their relationship quietly deteriorated in the background. He glanced at his phone once again, tempted to call her once more, but part of him was afraid of what he might hear. He was terrified that the call might not bring any closure, just more confusion. Maybe she would apologize, but how could a simple apology make up for this? As the night wore on, Ryan sank into a chair, his head heavy with unanswered questions. Every passing moment felt like it was eroding his sense of reality. Emily was not answering his calls. The strangers were gone, but the implications of their presence lingered in the apartment. The trust he thought he had in Emily, the foundation of their relationship, felt like it had cracked irreparably. He needed to see her. He needed to confront her, to look her in the eye and demand the truth. But with every passing minute, he realized just how much more complicated everything had become. Was this just an oversight on her part? Or was there something more? Ryan didn't know, but one thing was certain. He couldn't live in this limbo any longer. He needed to face whatever truth was waiting for him. He grabbed his keys and left the apartment again, this time with a purpose. He had no idea where Emily was, but he was going to find her. The anger, the pain, and the uncertainty gnawed at him with every step. And deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had worked so hard to build, everything he thought he had with Emily, was slipping through his fingers. The night was still young, but the darkness that surrounded him felt heavier than ever. The following days after his unsettling return to the apartment were a whirlwind of emotions for Ryan. Each day, the questions that plagued him seemed to multiply. Why had Emily rented out their apartment without telling him? Why hadn't she informed him before he left, or during his absence? And more importantly, why hadn't she bothered to reach out to him when he returned? Every attempt to contact her had been met with silence, and it was beginning to feel like a deliberate avoidance. As the silence continued, Ryan found himself spiraling into a whirlwind of frustration and hurt. He spent hours replaying their past conversations, searching for some clue, some indication that things hadn't been as perfect as he had assumed. Was he that out of touch with their relationship? Had Emily been hiding something from him this entire time? One evening, after yet another unanswered call and a day spent trying to make sense of it all, Ryan decided to take matters into his own hands. He knew he needed to hear Emily's side of the story. No matter how painful it might be, he couldn't move forward without understanding what had happened. He couldn't keep spinning in this sea of doubt. Ryan tracked down one of Emily's closest friends, Sarah, in an attempt to piece together what was going on. Sarah, a longtime confidant of Emily's, seemed hesitant to talk, at first sensing that Ryan was coming from a place of pain and betrayal. After a few uncomfortable moments of silence, Sarah finally relented and agreed to meet him at a nearby coffee shop. Sitting across from Sarah, Ryan was filled with a mixture of anger, confusion, and a strange sense of anticipation. He had hoped to get some clarity, but as Sarah began to speak, he quickly realized how little he knew about Emily's life during the past 6 months. Well, Sarah began shifting uncomfortably in her seat. "I don't know everything, but I do know that Emily was struggling while you were away." Ryan's heart sank as Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. She wasn't doing as well as you probably thought. You were gone for a long time, and she started to feel, well, I guess you could say distant. She didn't want to tell you, but she felt really alone in New York, especially after everything changed. Ryan's mind raced. What do you mean everything changed? She didn't tell me anything about feeling distant or alone. She said everything was fine. We had our usual calls, the same messages. What changed? Sarah hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. You have to understand, Ryan. Emily was dealing with a lot of things on her own. She felt the pressure of being in a relationship where you were miles away. It wasn't just the distance, it was the fact that you weren't physically there to support her. She started feeling like she was carrying everything on her own. The weight of it all just kinda piled up. Ryan sat back, absorbing Sarah's words. It was a lot to process. He never imagined that Emily had been feeling this way. Sure, they'd had their occasional disagreements, but he had always believed that their bond was strong enough to withstand the challenges of long distance. Was she really so overwhelmed that she had to act out in this way? Sarah continued, her voice softening. She didn't mean for things to get out of hand, I think. I think she just felt desperate. She didn't know how to handle the loneliness and the uncertainty. And honestly, I think she felt like she had lost control of her own life while you were gone. Renting the apartment out was her way of taking control, I guess. It was a rash decision. She should have talked to you about it, but I think she was afraid that you'd be disappointed in her. Ryan felt a tight knot in his stomach. He hadn't seen this side of Emily. He had always thought of her as strong, independent, someone who could handle anything. To hear that she had been struggling so much that she had felt so isolated and helpless was a hard pill to swallow. But there was still the question of why she hadn't come to him sooner. Why hadn't she confided in him when she first started feeling this way? Sarah seemed to sense Ryan's frustration and added, I think she didn't want to burden you with her problems. She didn't want you to feel like you had to choose between your career and your relationship. She was trying to protect you in her own way. But it backfired. Ryan's anger began to ebb, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. He hadn't realized just how much Emily had been internalizing during his absence. He had been so focused on his work, on the demands of his job, that he hadn't stopped to ask her how she was truly doing. But the more Ryan thought about it, the more a new question emerged. If she had been feeling this way, why didn't she reach out sooner? Was it really just about protecting him, or had there been something more to it? Emily was never one to shy away from difficult conversations. At least that was how he had always known her to be. So, why had she kept everything bottled up inside? Why had she made the decision to rent out his apartment without ever discussing it with him first? Did she say anything else? Ryan asked, his voice tight with frustration. Sarah shook her head, her face filled with sympathy. I don't know. She wasn't herself. And then, when you came back, I think she panicked. She didn't know how to fix things. She didn't want to disappoint you, but she felt like she had already messed up. Ryan sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing everything Sarah had just said. The realization that Emily hadn't meant to hurt him, that she had been acting out of a deep-seated fear of losing control, hit him harder than anything else. But it didn't make the situation any less painful. He still didn't have the one thing he needed most, the opportunity to talk to Emily directly, to hear her explain everything to him. With a quiet sigh, Ryan stood up, his mind still racing. I need to talk to her. Sarah, I need to hear it from her. As he left the coffee shop, his heart was heavy with conflicting emotions. The more he uncovered about Emily's actions, the less clear everything seemed. Yes, he understood that she had been struggling, that her decisions had come from a place of fear and loneliness. But it didn't erase the hurt of being left in the dark. The silence had hurt more than anything. And now, it was time to confront Emily, to hear her side of the story. Firsthand, Ryan wasn't sure what to expect when they finally spoke, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, it would change the course of their relationship forever. The days following his conversation with Sarah were a blur of conflicting emotions. Ryan had a better understanding of Emily's struggles, but the realization that she had rented out their apartment without any prior discussion still gnawed at him. Every interaction with Emily, or rather, the absence of any interaction, felt like a weight on his chest. It wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It was about trust, about communication, and about whether or not they could move past this. Ryan tried to reach out to Emily numerous times. Text calls and even emails went unanswered. Each day the silence grew louder and the frustration more intense. The apartment, once a symbol of their shared life, now felt cold and foreign. He couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, the image of strangers living in a space that was supposed to be theirs. But as much as he resented what had happened, a part of him still yearned for closure. He needed to understand why Emily had cut him off so completely. At night, Ryan would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying their past arguments, their laughter, their plans for the future. Had he missed the signs? Had Emily been struggling long before he left for his business trip? Was he too wrapped up in his work to notice that things were falling apart? One evening after another fruitless attempt to reach Emily, Ryan found himself standing outside their old apartment building. He had walked by it countless times over the years, but tonight it felt like a foreign place. The building loomed over him, its exterior unchanged, but the memories of the life they had shared inside it now felt like a distant dream. The emotions swirling inside him, anger, confusion, and deep hurt were at their peak. He knew he couldn't go on like this, unsure of what had happened, uncertain of what the future held. That night, after hours of internal conflict, Ryan made a decision. He would go to Emily's apartment. He would confront her face to face. No more calls, no more unanswered texts. He had to know the truth. He had to hear it from her. When he arrived at Emily's building, his heart pounded in his chest. The once familiar halls felt unfamiliar now, as though he were walking through a place he no longer belonged. Ryan had been to Emily's apartment countless times, but tonight everything felt different. Every step he took was heavier than the last. The elevator ride to her floor seemed interminable. He stood there staring at the mirrored walls, trying to steady his breath. What would he say to her? What would she say to him? What would happen after this conversation? The uncertainty of it all gnawed at him, but he knew that he needed this confrontation. He needed to know if they could fix things, or if they were too broken to salvage. When the elevator doors opened, Ryan hesitated for a moment before stepping out. He walked down the hallway to her door, his hand hovering over the doorbell. He took a deep breath before pressing it. The seconds felt like hours as he waited for her to answer. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Emily who greeted him. It was one of her roommates. The woman looked surprised to see Ryan standing there. Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. Ryan was momentarily taken aback. "Is Emily here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "She's not home right now." "Can I tell her who stopped by?" Ryan's frustration bubbled to the surface. It's Ryan. I'm her boyfriend." The roommate's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Oh, I didn't know you were back. I've been trying to reach her." Ryan said, his tone tight. "I really need to talk to her. It's important." The roommate hesitated before stepping aside, clearly reluctant. "I'm not sure when she'll be back, but I'll let her know you came by." Ryan felt his patience beginning to fray. "Please, it's important. I need to talk to her now." "I understand," the roommate said, but she was already backing away. "I'll pass the message along." Ryan felt a deep sense of helplessness wash over him. It seemed like no matter where he turned, Emily was shutting him out. He stood there for a moment, staring at the door before walking away, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him even harder. The next few days were filled with even more silence. Ryan was growing exhausted not just from the constant rejection, but from the lack of any clear answers. He had tried everything. He had reached out to Emily's friends, he had gone to her apartment, and still nothing. The questions remained unanswered. Why did she shut him out? Why didn't she want to talk? Was there more to this than just the apartment? Ryan knew he had to make a decision soon. The longer this dragged on, the more he began to question the future of their relationship. He couldn't keep waiting indefinitely for Emily to open up. The situation wasn't healthy for either of them, and he needed to take control of his own life. But there was also a part of him that wasn't ready to give up. He still loved Emily, and a part of him believed that they could work through this. that the trust and connection they had built over the years was worth salvaging. One afternoon after another, long day of contemplation, Ryan made the decision that would change everything. He couldn't keep living in limbo, uncertain of whether Emily would ever explain herself. It was time for him to make a choice about his future, with or without her. That evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, Ryan took a deep breath and composed one final message to Emily. It wasn't accusatory or angry. Instead, it was an invitation, a chance for them to sit down and talk to clear the air and figure out where they stood. The message was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he had been feeling for the past few weeks. Emily, I've tried reaching out to you multiple times, but I'm still left in the dark about what happened between us. I need closure, and I need to hear from you. If you're open to it, I'd like us to sit down and talk about everything. Please let me know when you're ready. Ryan sent the message and put his phone down, bracing himself for whatever would come next. Would she respond? Would she agree to talk? Or would this be the final goodbye? As he waited for her response, Ryan realized something. No matter what happened next, this moment, the decision to face the truth, to confront the tension between them, was the turning point. Whether they could move forward together or not, Ryan knew that this was the beginning of something new, even if it meant walking away from the relationship he had once thought would last forever. Ryan's phone sat on the table before him, the screen dark, but the tension in the room palpable. His message to Emily had been sent hours ago, and yet no response had come through. Each passing minute seemed to drag on longer than the last. He had made his decision. He would no longer let the uncertainty linger. Whether Emily replied or not, he knew he needed to find peace in this situation, whatever the outcome. As he sat there staring at the phone, a mix of emotions swirled inside him: frustration, anger, hurt. But underneath it all was a deep sadness, a realization that things between him and Emily were no longer the same. The carefree love they had once shared now felt distant, like a dream he could barely remember. For so long he had kept himself in the dark, trying to avoid confronting the truth. But now, after months of silence and distance, Ryan knew he couldn't keep living like this. He had loved Emily deeply, and in many ways, he still did. But the truth was, love alone wasn't enough to fix everything. The foundation of their relationship had been cracked by lies, by silence, by decisions made in the dark, and it was impossible to rebuild something that had been so fundamentally broken. The apartment, the betrayal, the constant shutting out. Each of these pieces of the puzzle had created a picture Ryan could no longer ignore. Ryan stood up abruptly, pacing around the room. His thoughts were racing. How had they ended up here? How had something that once felt so right fallen apart so quickly? He remembered when he and Emily had first met, how easy it had felt, how natural they had been, a team facing the world together. But now there was nothing left but emptiness and unanswered questions. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft buzz. It was a message notification from Emily. Ryan's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly snatched up the phone. It wasn't a long message, just a few short lines, but it carried weight. Emily had finally replied, "Ryan, I'm sorry. I didn't know how to tell you the truth. I've been feeling lost, like I was living in your shadow while you were gone. I rented the apartment out because I needed a fresh start, but I see now how wrong that was. I've been selfish, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to explain. Can we meet?" The words hit Ryan harder than he expected. Part of him wanted to feel relieved, finally, some sort of explanation. But another part of him felt even more confused. Emily's message was a mix of regret and justification, an acknowledgement of her actions, but also an unwillingness to fully take responsibility. Ryan stared at the message, letting the weight of it sink in. She was sorry, but was that enough? Was it enough for him to go back to the life they once had? Was it enough for him to let go of the anger, the betrayal, and everything that had happened over the past few months? The truth was, Ryan had already made up his mind. He had spent so long trying to understand Emily's actions, trying to make sense of her decisions, but the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. They weren't the same people they had been when he left. She had changed, he had changed, and the relationship, despite all the love they once had changed too. The decision was never going to be easy, but it had to be made. Ryan's hand hovered over the phone, unsure of how to respond. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he typed his reply. "Emily, I think we need to talk, but not here, not over text. We need to face everything that's happened between us and decide what comes next. I'm open to hearing your side, but I can't keep pretending everything's okay. I'll meet you at the park tomorrow. 3 p.m. If you're ready to talk, I'll be there." He sent the message and sat back down, letting out a long breath. It felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest, but it was also heavy with the uncertainty of what the meeting would bring. The ball was in Emily's court now. That night, Ryan didn't sleep much. His mind kept running through the possibilities of what could happen next. Emily could show up, they could talk, and maybe they could find a way to rebuild, or she could choose to walk away entirely, leaving Ryan with the hard reality that their time had come to an end. Either way, the finality of the situation loomed over him. He could no longer live in limbo. The next day, Ryan made his way to the park. The air was crisp, and the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind did little to calm his racing heart. He arrived early, pacing back and forth along the path as he waited for Emily. His mind was filled with a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that this conversation could lead to healing, dread that it might be the final chapter of their story together. As the clock ticked closer to 3 p.m., Ryan saw a figure approaching from the distance, Emily. She looked different, distant like a stranger, yet familiar at the same time. The weight of the past few months seemed to hang over her too, and Ryan felt a pang in his chest as she walked toward him. The woman he had once known so intimately now seemed like a person he was seeing for the first time. When she reached him, there was a long pause, a moment of silence that felt endless. Neither of them knew where to start. "Hey," Ryan said, his voice quieter than usual. "Hey, Emily," replied softly. Her eyes flickering between him and the ground, Ryan took a deep breath. This was it. The moment of truth, Emily. He began, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't know where we go from here, but I need you to be honest with me. Why did you do this? Why did you shut me out? Why didn't you trust me enough to talk to me before all this happened?" Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come right away. It was clear that everything she had been holding inside was ready to spill out, but the weight of it all was overwhelming. She started, her voice cracking. "I didn't know how to tell you. Ryan, I didn't know how to tell you that I felt like I was losing myself while you were gone. I rented the apartment because I needed a way out, a way to feel like I was in control again. I made a mistake, I see that now, but I didn't know what else to do." Ryan's heart ached as he listened to her explanation. He could see the pain in her eyes, and for a moment he wondered if it was possible to forgive her, to forgive everything. But he also knew he couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. Trust had been broken, and it was hard to see a way back from that. "I get that," Ryan said, his voice calm but firm. "But you have to understand, Emily, what you did. Shutting me out like that, making decisions without me. It hurt. And I don't know if I can just forget that." There was a long silence as the two of them stood there, the weight of the past few months settling between them. The decision had been made, and now they had to decide what to do with it. As the days passed following their conversation at the park, Ryan couldn't help but reflect on everything that had unfolded. The initial shock of returning home to find strangers living in his apartment had been overwhelming, but the emotional roller coaster of confronting Emily had left him with a greater sense of clarity. The tension between them had finally reached a tipping point, and while the conversation hadn't solved everything, it had sparked a change in both of them. They had shared their pain, their confusion, and their regrets, but more importantly, they had faced the truth. The relationship as it had been couldn't continue the same way. Ryan had come to terms with that, but just as importantly, he realized that this didn't mean he had to give up on himself. He didn't have to stay trapped in the cycle of anger and hurt that had defined the last few months. It was time for both of them to grow, not just as a couple, but individually. In the end, they had both been on separate journeys, each struggling with their own personal challenges, and perhaps it was time to face those challenges head on. Ryan's thoughts kept drifting back to the life he had built for himself before the business trip. When he had first arrived in New York, fresh out of college and ready to make his mark on the world, he had been focused on his career, chasing success, and trying to prove himself. Emily had come into his life like a breath of fresh air, bringing with her love and support, but also unknowingly a few burdens of her own. As much as he had been busy building his career, he had neglected the deeper connection between them, assuming that the love they shared would simply withstand the test of time. But love, Ryan realized, needed work. It needed attention, communication, and understanding. As he sat at his kitchen table one morning, sipping coffee and looking out over the city, Ryan decided it was time to refocus, not just on his career, but on himself. He had spent too long pushing his own needs aside, suppressing his emotions in order to avoid conflict. It was time to prioritize his mental and emotional well-being, to rebuild his sense of self outside of his relationship with Emily. The first step toward moving forward was taking a break from the emotional chaos. He needed time to heal, to clear his mind, and to rediscover the person he had been before everything had gone wrong. He enrolled in a yoga class, something he had always wanted to try but had never made time for. The stretching breathing and moments of quiet reflection gave him a new sense of peace. It wasn't a cure-all, but it helped him regain some control over his life, even if just for a few hours a week. He also began to take more time for himself, going on solo hikes in the mountains nearby, reconnecting with nature. The solitude allowed him to think deeply, to process the events of the past months, and to reflect on the lessons he had learned. He had been so focused on the noise of the world, on expectations, his families, his friends, his colleagues, that he had forgotten to listen to his own voice. The hiking trips became an important ritual, a way to clear his head and recalibrate his life. Meanwhile, Emily had been doing her own soul-searching. Ryan wasn't sure where their relationship stood, but he could see that Emily was making efforts to change. She had apologized and acknowledged her mistakes, and while he wasn't ready to forgive her completely yet, he appreciated the growth he could see in her. She had taken time off work to reflect on the decisions she had made during his absence. Ryan had learned that Emily had been battling her own internal struggles, insecurities, fears of being inadequate, and a deep-seated fear of being abandoned. She had felt neglected, lost in the shadows of Ryan's busy life, and that led her to make decisions she would later regret. Emily began therapy, and for the first time in a long while, Ryan saw the old Emily, the woman who had once been so full of life and enthusiasm. She wasn't perfect, and neither was he, but both of them were learning how to move forward. One evening, about a month after their conversation in the park, Emily reached out again. This time she didn't ask to meet in person. Instead, she suggested they talk over the phone. Ryan agreed, still unsure of where their relationship would go, but willing to keep the door open to reconciliation. The conversation was calm. There were no tears, no harsh words, just two people acknowledging the reality of their situation. Emily expressed her gratitude for the time Ryan had taken to reflect and heal, and she told him she had been doing the same. It wasn't a grand declaration of love, nor was it an ultimatum. It was simply an acknowledgement that both of them had learned valuable lessons through their individual journeys. "I don't know what the future holds for us, Ryan," Emily said softly, "but I'm learning that we can't keep living in the past. We both need to focus on ourselves first before we can be anything to each other." Ryan felt a weight lift off his chest as he listened to her words. He knew she was right. They couldn't keep circling around old hurts and misunderstandings. If there was to be any hope for their relationship, it would have to come from a place of growth individually and together. "I agree," Ryan replied, his voice steady. "I need time too to figure things out, but I'm willing to work on myself, and if we can find a way to meet in the middle, maybe we can build something better, something healthier." The conversation ended on a positive note, though both of them knew there were still many steps ahead. For the first time in months, Ryan felt a sense of peace. He wasn't rushing into any decisions, but he wasn't running away from the possibility of a future with Emily either. He was taking his time, growing, learning, and embracing the fact that moving forward was a process. The days continued to pass, and while there was still uncertainty, Ryan felt a sense of hope creeping back into his life. He had rediscovered the importance of self-care, of finding balance in the chaos, and of prioritizing his own happiness before he could give to others. Whether or not his future with Emily would materialize, he knew that he was in control of his own path. Now months had passed since that fateful day Ryan came home to find strangers living in his apartment. The weeks following his emotional confrontation with Emily had been a whirlwind of self-discovery, healing, and ultimately growth. What seemed like a devastating blow to his life had slowly turned into a turning point, not only for his relationship, but for him as an individual. The journey was far from over, but Ryan had come to realize that he was in control of his own destiny. Ryan had kept his distance from Emily during the first few months after their conversation. He had taken the time he needed to focus on himself and his own healing. During this time, he found solace in the activities that had always helped him clear his mind: hiking, yoga, journaling, and spending time with friends. His apartment, once a symbol of the life he had shared with Emily, had become his sanctuary. But as time passed, Ryan began to miss the person he had been before the fallout. He missed the companionship, the deep conversations, and even the small moments that had once seemed so insignificant. It wasn't that he was rushing back into a relationship with Emily, but he found himself thinking about her more often. The healing had allowed him to see things more clearly, and he knew now that their love wasn't something he could just throw away. It had to be rebuilt, piece by piece, starting with honesty and vulnerability. In the months that followed, Emily continued her therapy and worked on her own personal growth. Ryan had seen her progress through mutual friends, and although they hadn't reconnected directly, he was proud of the steps she had taken. There were times when he wanted to reach out to her, but he reminded himself that the best way to move forward was to allow both of them the space they needed. This wasn't about rushing into anything. It was about finding peace and balance first. One evening, as the sun set over the skyline of the city, Ryan sat on his balcony, sipping a drink in solitude. The city was bustling below, yet he felt a calm that had eluded him for so long. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Emily. "Hey, Ryan, I hope you're doing well. I was wondering if we could meet up sometime. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, and I'd like to talk more. No pressure, just whenever you're ready." Ryan paused for a moment, staring at the message. His heart raced, but this time it was different. There was no anxiety or fear. It was just a simple acknowledgement that both of them had moved forward and were ready to see what might lie ahead. After a few seconds of contemplation, Ryan typed his reply. "I think that sounds good. Let's set something up. I'd like to talk too." As they arranged to meet the following week, Ryan felt a sense of quiet anticipation. He didn't know what the future held, and he wasn't in a rush to find out. This was a new chapter, one where he had learned the importance of self-worth, trust, and communication. Whatever happened with Emily, he was ready to face it with an open heart, free from the baggage of the past. On the day of their meeting, Ryan arrived at the cafe they had chosen his mind, calm, but his thoughts racing. He was no longer the man who had returned from his trip with a broken heart and a bruised ego. He had transformed into someone more self-aware, more grounded, and more ready to face life with resilience. When Emily arrived, there was an air of nervousness between them, but also a quiet understanding. They greeted each other with smiles, and for the first time in a long while, Ryan saw the woman he had fallen in love with. She had changed, but it was clear that the core of who she was, the person he had once shared his life with, was still there. Their conversation was slow and deliberate, not rushed. They talked about their individual growth, the mistakes they had made, and the lessons they had learned. There was no animosity, no blaming, just a mutual understanding that they were both better for the journey they had been on. By the end of the meeting, they had decided that while the road ahead was still uncertain, they would continue to take things one step at a time. There was no rush to define what they were, but they were open to seeing where things might go. As Ryan left the cafe, he felt lighter than he had in months. The weight of the past hadn't completely disappeared, but he was no longer carrying it like a burden. He had found peace, and for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful about the future. In the months that followed, Ryan and Emily continued to rebuild their relationship slowly with care and with a deep understanding of each other's needs. There were still challenges, but they faced them with a renewed sense of trust and communication. Ryan continued to focus on his personal growth, and Emily too worked on her own healing. Together, they moved forward, not with the expectation of perfection, but with the understanding that love, like life, is a journey that is ever evolving. As the seasons changed, so did they. The future was no longer a source of fear. Ryan knew that whatever it held, he was ready to face it, not as the person he had been when he returned from his trip, but as someone stronger, more self-aware, and willing to embrace life's unpredictability. In the end, it wasn't about the apartment or the strangers who had lived there. It was about the transformation that had taken place in Ryan's heart, and the quiet acceptance that no matter where life took him, he was finally in control of his own story.